my God and gender, aren't we just all the same? That's a common question that I will hear people use sometimes when in talking about issues of gender and issues of religion. Aren't we just all the same? We're all the same. Well, not quite. In fact, we're here tonight to talk about diversity, not to talk about how we all match, because this is really important to note, and that the individuality of God's creations is really important as well. We erase the diversity of humanity when we say we're all the same. Because if we say we're all the same, we don't acknowledge the importance of somebody's differences or their marginalizations, i.e. the oppressions that they might face. And so particularly in Western society, there is a privilege that is given to people who are attractive. There are privileges that are given to people who are heterosexual. There are privileges given to people who are white. And this is reflected in the biblical art of Western Europe, white, thin, and heteronormative. The example I have for you here is the Last Supper of Leonardo da Vinci. Would Jesus and the disciples have been straight? Would they have been white? Would they have been cisgender men? And I ask who is missing. And I ask that not to get a response, but I just want you to start thinking about that. If you look at this table of Jesus's followers, it doesn't look very inclusive, does it? It looks like it looks like there's quite a few people who are missing from this story. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a gender 101 for those who don't already know. And I put at the top that gender is a construct. So the construct of gender was talked about by feminist author Judith Butler. And Judith Butler, they break down the idea of gender is not something that you were assigned at birth. Gender is your lived experience. And the thing that your lived experience as your gender is not what society places upon you. It's really your autonomous being. And so one's gender doesn't have to correspond with the gender assigned at birth. Similarly, but also different, one's sexuality is not always related to their gender. And so it's really important to recognize that sexuality and gender are their own things. So I have here the gender unicorn. And the gender unicorn is what we have as identity, expression, assigned gender at birth, physical attraction, and emotional attraction. Because all of those things could be similar, all of them could be different. You could be a man who has a masculine gender expression, who was assigned male at birth, who's attracted to men and other genders, and emotionally attracted to men and other genders. You could be a cisgender man and be pansexual in that instance. But you could also, say, be assigned male at birth, but your identity is a woman, your expression is feminine, you are physically attracted to women, you are emotionally attracted to women, you can be a transgender woman and a lesbian. So our system of the gender binary categorizes people before they are born, taking autonomy away from a person's gender, a gender that they know is to be their own. So for example, I'm a transgender and non-binary person, my pronouns are they, them. I am panromantic, which means I am romantically attracted to all genders, demisexual on the asexual spectrum as not feeling sexual attraction or having sexual attraction on a spectrum. It doesn't matter what my assigned gender is. It matters what my gender is. So I want to say that that's very important because you're going to see that even in the course of biblical history, that those identities and those ways of being are the case. So a couple terms you're going to see throughout this presentation are cisgender, identifying with the gender you are assigned at birth, transgender, which can be a specific term or an umbrella term for not identifying with the gender you were assigned at birth. That's it. No surgery, no hormones, no nothing. That's up to you. That's up to the individual person. A person who is trans because they say they are trans. An intersex person is somebody who is born with a combination of hormones or secondary sex characteristics. There is a pejorative and triggering term I'm about to use that used to be used for intersex people, and I would ask that none of you ever use it from this point on. And intersex people were pejoratively referred to as hermaphrodites. That is an incorrect term and is not one used by the intersex community. So intersex people face oppression from coercive gender assignment as well, and often will face, without their consent as infants, corrective surgery to make them like one of the more genders on the binary. There are countries and organizations that are working to outlaw these corrective practices. And I say corrective, not in a corrective sense at all. You will also learn that intersex people are a part of God's creation, and are biblically founded. And then non-binary, someone whose gender is outside of the binary, as neither male nor female. So this is a point where, if you feel free, you can unmute yourself or mention it in the chat. Where are our first introductions to gender in the Bible?
It's in Genesis chapter 1 when God creates Adam and Eve.
Correct. That's like our first conception of gender. That is our first conception of gender. And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth.
And then it has start.
And over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the air.
What about start video?
And over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Genesis 1, 26 to 28. Just as Connor said, male and female he created them. What does this part of the passage mean to you? And who are the people who are writing this thousands of years ago, you think? Feel free to unmute if you'd like to talk.
I believe that the people that wrote the Jewish Bible were rabbis and scribes post Moses, because we know that it wasn't written in the beginning, but it was before Jesus, and like. To me, that part of Genesis means that we're all created in God's image, and it does not matter how we identify. It's male, female, trans, non-binary. Like we're all equal.
Yeah. Anybody else want to say anything about what male and female he created them means to you? You feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to talk.
Yeah, actually, I've been thinking a lot about this this Bible verse over the last week. I think Father Dirk spoke about it as well, and I'm a big fan of the book of Genesis. But for the first time, I was looking at it in the context of what he was saying. Like, and sometimes the translation here makes a little difference. Like the one we were looking at last week says, so God created humans to be like himself. He made men and women, right? And I saw that in the context for the first time. It wasn't really so much even about men or women. It's just that he made more than one thing, right? He made them to be in relationship. When it says God created humans to be like himself, the verse before that talks about God in the plural, the Trinity. And for the first, I think that's really, and you read some of the different translations, you get a very different meaning, which is always a little scary. Like what the heck's the right translation? I don't know. But I found it just, again, I've been thinking about this all week about how it really seems to be more about, not so much about men and women, but he made people to be in relationship, right? I mean, that seems to be what he's trying to say. There's the Trinity up here. We want to be in our image, and that means you got to have more than one. You got to be in relationship with somebody. And I was talking about that a little bit in my, the confirmation class this week. And then, you cut forward to, Noah and the ark, and it was 2 by 2 again. It's like we're not meant to be alone, right? And that's kind of my new revelation on this particular passage this week, anyway.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very insightful. I really appreciate that. I'm going to go on unless somebody else would like to say something.
I'm just curious about what you say about the line, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Now, who's going to be fruitful and multiply? Which of the people you're talking about?
We're about to find out.
Good.
I think I'll put it that way.
Because I'm curious.
Trans people, cis people, multi-gendered people, people with uteruses who are with people without uteruses, or people with uteruses who adopt. Fruitful and multiply means many things, so we're going to see what that looks like. So let's talk a little bit about Adam and Eve, but let's also ask ourselves a question. Where is Lilith? Da, da, da. Our first biblical introduction to gender comes from Genesis, as we've determined, the ever infamous male and female. He created them in the story of Adam and Eve in the garden and the sin of disobedience from God. Now, not mentioned in the Bible or the Torah, but in Jewish folklore was a very significant figure, the character Lilith, who was the first wife of Adam in Jewish folklore. So that's very interesting to note here, is that I don't want to just talk about Adam and Eve, but I also want to talk about who doesn't get involved in the main biblical narrative and what are some of the reasons as to why. So Lilith has origins as a Sumerian figure who is an independent feminine, maybe pejoratively in the sense of what some would call a succubus or a vampiric figure, someone who is empowering or demonic. She does not submit to Adam's authority, and she leaves the garden because she asserts that both Adam and Lilith were created from the dust of the earth. That's very different than, say, the story of Eve and Adam, where Eve is of man. So that lineage is very different in the sense that if we think about, as we've discussed, God's creation being diverse and being more than one, and the fact that there is a sameness between Adam and Lilith in the sense that they were equitable from the dust, it suggests that our genders are to be equitable with one another and not to be in domination. Whereas Eve's story is a little bit different. So Eve is from Adam, from the rib, not like the dust of the earth. She is the first to eat of the fruit not permitted by God. And then, of course, her punishment is to be condemned to bear the pain of childbirth. The portrayal of Eve has often been used by reactionaries to subdue women, non-men, and marginalized genders. And the archetype of Lilith is also used as a way to subdue women, non-men, and marginalized genders, particularly by fundamentalists and conservatives, usually to stigmatize feminism, using pejoratives such as feminazis or men haters, used among dangerous group of people who are primarily white cisgender able-bodied men who are known as involuntary celibates or men's rights activists. And these people are the same people who tend to perpetuate sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, usually through doxing, stalking, harassing people to somehow regain their masculine privilege that was lost, which never was lost in the context of cisgender heterosexual patriarchy. And more on this in the next slide. So this is a particularly triggering passage. If you read it, it would sound like it came out of 1850, but it was written in 2019, referencing Pope Leo the 13th, who lived from the 1800s into the turn of the 20th century. So Jerry Salyer writes, women, writes Leo the 13th in Rerum Novarum, this is a Catholic publication, are not suited for certain occupations, for a woman is by nature fitted for homework, and is that which best adapted at once to preserve her modesty, and to promote the good bringing up of children and the well-being of the family. How such statements have not received more attention is at first glance baffling, given how often rerum novarum has often been the occasion of debates between Catholic communitarians and integralists on the one hand, and proponents of free market economics on the other. My suspicion is that the reason lies in a general Catholic reluctance to confront those modern sensibilities that are especially hardwired into the popular consciousness. We already have to explain to unsympathetic listeners why we hesitate to admit gay marriage and transgender bathrooms. So the reasoning goings, why pursue a bridge too far by questioning the modern understanding of equality of men and women? As you can see, Jerry Sallier doesn't really write about equality at all. In fact, he's using very convincing rhetoric to his readership in order to perpetuate transphobia, homophobia, and sexism. So now we find out the roles of women, non-men, and marginalized genders in biblical times. Because it is important to note, in terms of scripture and tradition, what women, non-men, and marginalized genders were doing and how they faced oppression, as well as how they combated oppression. So I like to think of scripture in feminist interpretations as both a product of patriarchy as well as a challenge to patriarchy. And I'll tell you why. Because one of the first things in terms of women and non-men as a product of patriarchy is that being conceived of as property. That was a fact. So in biblical times, women were seen as property, and women couldn't divorce, but men could. So a man could divorce a husband if she couldn't cook. I mean, a man could divorce a wife if she couldn't cook well. Like, oh, you burnt the bread, get out of my house. Like, it's, you know, that's why when you see Christ condemning divorce, it wasn't Christ saying, let's be married for all of eternity. It was Christ saying, maybe we should think about the reasons as to why we enter into partnerships and try not to be trivial with one another. Women also relegated to supporting characters for the development of men. Gender nonconformity as well discouraged only in the sense of it not being culturally acknowledged. So I had often seen growing up from traditional Catholics to not wear men's clothing because it would be unbecoming of me for my assigned gender. Cisgender men primarily, or as we know they might be cisgender men, occupying leadership roles through lineage, so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, etc. But as a challenge to patriarchy, women who had agency did revolutionary things. Ruth, Esther, Judith, Miriam, Mary Magdalene, and the people who were most revered by Jesus were not, say the women that these traditionalists talk about as being the epitome of womanhood. These women and non-men and marginalized genders were frequently in positions of oppression. They were sick, they were servants, they were divorced, they were ostracized, they were sex workers, they were poor. There was not a sense from Christ as to who was more deserving in terms of a marginalized gender or not. It's just like the reading we had this past Sunday. Tax collectors and sex workers shall be admitted to the kingdom of heaven, and there's no exception here. Also, I want to note that care work is especially important when we talk about passing on the faith, of evangelism, of doing the good news, of spreading the good news. Care work is essential. So the care work that women, non-men, and marginalized genders do, whether it's educating our children and our families about the faith, whether it is doing domestic labor, whether it is being an educator of your friends in the community, or being a reader at church, or whatever you do as a woman, non-man, or a marginalized gender that helps somebody come to a level of critical consciousness in regards to their faith, that's care work. That's taking care of one another. And I don't think it's an accident biblically that it was marginalized genders who are the first to see the resurrected body of Christ. Because as we know from the understandings of the 12 apostles, when it came to the crucifixion and the resurrection,
Brit, we can't hear you.
Are we good? All right.
Should be.
Okay. Let's try that again now, shall we? Okay. Let's get us back on share. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Go back in this presentation a little bit because I went ahead of myself. So in short, I just would like to say that women, non-men, and marginalized genders do a lot, been through a lot, continue to do a lot. And there's a plethora of identities that we've talked about. Transgender people, intersex people, gender non-conforming people, cisgender people, people who identify with the gender they're assigned at birth. And I want to talk a little bit about those gender identities that were in biblical times. So in the Talmud, which is a text of Judaism, Judaism actually refers to cis, trans, non-binary, and intersex people and has names for them. So a Zachar is a cisgender man, a Nekeva, a cisgender woman, androgynous, this is my favorite one, a person with characteristics of a man or woman. There are Reform rabbinical scholars who assert that Adam may have been androgynous. So the whole idea of even Adam being a cisgender man is something that we have assumed over the course of many years, when there's scholarship out there that suggests that Adam may not have been a cisgender man at all. Or Tumtum, which is a person whose characteristics are indeterminate, potentially an intersex person. Ilonite, an assigned female at birth person who develops male characteristics at puberty. Also Saris, an assigned male at birth person who develops female characteristics at puberty. So here we are. This is historical. The Talmud already has lined out that these identities have existed. And so it's not that, I want to discount the notion that, like, if you see your children or you see your siblings' children or your friends' children, and they're identifying as a gender different than the one they're assigned at birth, it's not something that they just learned on YouTube or on Tumblr. This is a very real thing for them. So I really do want to acknowledge the fact that, these genders are very important to people. People's gender identities are very important to them. So if they're important to them, we should acknowledge them. And gender variance is supported in scripture. So for example, I'm going to read to you the passages of Galatians, Matthew, and Isaiah, because we talk about gender neutrality as well as other third genders such as eunuchs, who were considered a gender of their own in biblical times. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. That's Galatians in the New Testament. Also from the Gospels, Matthew. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. So there's a case for gender neutrality, as well as affirming procedures for a third gender. in Matthew. And then Isaiah, the Old Testament, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant. I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. So, these genders have been around for a long time. Your kids didn't just learn about them on YouTube and Tumblr. They've been around since the dawn of time eternal. So let's talk. Gender nonconformity and Christ. So what were some ways that Christ did not conform to the gender roles that would have been expected of them? What do you think Christ was supposed to be doing, according to Christ's very Jewish parents? What do you think Christ was supposed to be doing? What kind of messages do you think Christ was getting from their family?
Supposed to have kids.
Supposed to have kids. Okay, somebody else.
Become a rabbi or become a carpenter, dad.
Yep. Get in the family business. What about you, Fran?
Oh, goodness. Well, he fed the 5,000, and that was a woman's job to feed people, right?
Yeah. Care work, right? So I talked about care work. Something a marginalized gender should be doing.
That's not a term that I've ever used, care work, but okay, if that's a good way to characterize it. Yeah.
Anyone else? What was Jesus supposed to be doing?
Supposed to be fighting. Wasn't he supposed to be the soldier? Wasn't he supposed to lead us? Wasn't he supposed to be, like the whole Palm Sunday thing with a big procession and all kinds of stuff? So he should have been the leader of the troops. Onward, Christian soldiers.
Yeah, the Messiah was supposed to be a king. The Messiah,
Oh, there you go. Okay.
yeah, the Messiah was expected to be a king which is a very patriarchal and patrilineal thing. So Christ, for all intents and purposes, was supposed to be a king who wasn't going to do domestic labor, who wasn't going to be a servant. So in that, how was Christ a feminist? Anyone else I haven't heard from?
Well, you mentioned it before, Brit. The idea that that Jesus was with women all the time. He gave them important assignments. He looked after the people who were on the margins. And I guess he did what you are calling care work with the people who were on the margins. He sought them out. And he also included women in his ministries in a way that we don't see them included. Most of the time when people reflect on the Gospels or Christian scripture, people will neglect the fact that women were such a primary force in Jesus's ministry.
That's excellent, Deacon. Thank you for that. And knowing these things, how much differently are we going to think about our children or our relatives' children or the people around us? Especially since I mentioned, this isn't stuff that just exists on YouTube and Tumblr. How are now we going to look at people differently when they are not following the dictates of the gender binary? Anyone who's a parent, I'd like a parent or someone who works with kids, I'd like to hear what you'd have to say.
I guess that's me.
Sure, Anne, go right ahead.
I talk a lot in Sunday school that God likes variety. That when we've been exploring these images of God that are so varied, but that as and my son Matthew is very good at reminding me that we are all made in God's image. Therefore, we were talking about a sense of humor. If we have a sense of humor, God must have a sense of humor. If we are reflective of these things, then God must also. So I think that's really important, and especially with dealing with kids, that however they are, they still reflect God, I think is worth repeating many times to children.
And I think the best way to affirm the humanity of children who are questioning or who are telling you what their identity is to honor it. It is, honor their pronouns, honor their chosen name, honor how they want to be addressed, honor what they may wish to do in the future with the autonomy of themselves. That's how we honor children, and that's how we honor our adult children and friends when they make these decisions. So this piece of artwork I have here, which was part of the promotional Neither by David Hayward. David Hayward was a pastor who quit being a pastor and decided to do art. And so one of David's things to do art with is to make representations of Christ. And so I find this to be a very fitting representation of Christ, an image of God. This is my image of God. This is my image of Christ. Christ is a Black transgender person. Ultimately, if we think about it on a historical and a level now, especially now in terms of the crux of where we are in American society, the person who is least respected and most likely to be marginalized and not accepted or not hired or even murdered is a Black transgender woman. And Black transgender women are statistically unlikely to live past the age of 35 because of this oppression. Christ was 33. Male and female, he created them? Nah. At this point, I'm pretty good. Exactly. Marsha P. Johnson. Great example, Connor. Marsha Johnson was a transgender advocate, a Black transgender woman and bisexual woman who was an advocate for people's rights and dignities. So this picture comes from a play in South America called The Gospel According to Jesus, Queen of Heaven, which is written by a trans woman, Jo Clifford. And Jo Clifford wrote this play in honor of Jesus, who respects and uplifts those cast out by society, which is exactly as just I mentioned, which is transgender women particularly. As soon as the play had premiered, it received death threats, particularly because of the kind of oppression that is faced by trans women and trans feminine folks, which is known as trans misogyny. So it's a specific misogyny that is faced by trans women or anybody who is gender non-conforming, who is assigned male or coercively assigned male at birth. This is a common oppression. And if we think about it even today in terms of our own societal mores that we place in terms of the gender binary on people, we tell cis women they have to be pretty. We tell cis men they have to be strong. But if we notice that somebody who is assigned male is being feminine, there's that association of sissy or wussy. Or we see somebody assigned female who is acting masculine as butch or as unattractive. I will tell you that the things that I was called growing up because I didn't conform to my assigned gender were butch and were lesbian, used as pejoratives, because there is a strong pressure in a cis heteronormative society to conform to a certain kind of gender role. But trans misogyny in particular, I find to be one of the greatest sins of transphobia, because it asserts that femininity is only in the scale of anybody who is a cisgender woman. And femininity is not something that needs to be gatekept. And Christ most certainly wasn't a gatekeeper of femininity, being someone who engaged in care work themselves. I love this still as well. Isn't that beautiful? Seeing a trans woman breaking the bread. Trans representations then and now. So now we have the biblical understandings of trans people, but let's see a little bit more about our tradition as Christians, as well as the present day, what kind of trans people are still doing this care work out there. I love this photo. This is like this beautiful photo. This is communion to me. That's my image. So, 3 people here that you ought to know are Marinos the monk, Saint Joan of Arc, and the public universal friend. So Marinos the monk, assigned female at birth, they were a person around the 5th or 8th century who was presenting masculine for most of their life. There was a bit of a scandal that happened later in their life where they had, I guess their gender was found out, i.e. their assigned gender or what have. You know, there's this sense of, you know, if someone's not conforming to their gender, they're committing a sin. There was a dispute, and then Marinos took in a child and decided to take care of the child. And then with Saint Joan of Arc, who was a warrior, Joan of Arc, who was also burned at the stake for gender nonconformity. There is an excellent black and white film. I want to say it's called The Passion of Joan of Arc, or The Passion according to Joan of Arc, and it's breathtaking if you haven't seen it. But I find that to be an excellent film in terms of talking about the kind of oppression that Joan of Arc faced from church leaders for doing the church's work that was required of what Joan was feeling called to do. And then the public universal friend. This is a great one. This is a great story. So the public universal friend is a Quaker who woke up one morning and had a dream that was revealed to them by God that no one called me by my birth name, nobody used pronouns for me, just call me the public universal friend. And guess what? People accepted it. There's an accept. Nobody said, but they, them is hard. Nobody said, but singular they. Nobody said, oh, this is, you know, they were just like, all right, you're the public universal friend. Cool for you. That's great. God intended it. You know, that's what we need. That's what we need when we're dealing with gender variant folks. It's like, all right, you're the public universal friend. So these are figures in Christian history who did not conform to their assigned gender. So just letting you know, they've been here. And these people, Christian or not, are still doing that work. Still doing that work. And these are my saints. So these are the people that I look to. And Alok Vaid Manan on the top left, they are a trans person, a poet and an activist. Dean Spade in the black and white to the right of them. Dean Spade, he is a lawyer and he's an advocate for racial justice. Then on to the right of Dean Spade is Leah Lakshmi Piepsana Samaranasasha, and they are the writer of Care Work. So Care Work, which is a book about disability justice. So Leah writes about disability justice. And if you haven't read Care Work, it's an excellent book because it talks about how queer, trans, disabled, people of color have pretty much been at the forefront of disability justice and justice for people and reproductive justice as well. To the right of Leah is Dane Aditi. Dane is a black trans woman. She's a poet and a playwright. India Moore on the bottom left. They are a non-binary actor and they are in the popular TV show Pose. To the right of India is Christian Lovehall. He is a black trans man and he's the lead organizer of the Philly Trans March. To the right of Christian Lovehall is Angelica Ross. She's a black trans woman and she's also an advocate and also stars on Pose with India Moore. And then the bottom right is the person who I think helped me the most in my own transition, and that's Jack Halberstam. Jack Halberstam is a white transmasculine person and they are a gender variant person who's written a number of books about gender variance, as well as critiques on oppression and patriarchy. So this divine work is ongoing, and I hope that my education and work in that is part of that same lineage. And here we are. You just made it through Gender 101. You made it through biblical gender, and we've talked about gender and gender variance and doing the work that is God's work and the divine work that's required today. So with that, do you have any comments or questions for me? Thank you so much. We can end the recording at this point, Anne. I appreciate this.